Government involvement in the market economy didn't start with the New Deal. It's always been there. In today's complex world, government and industry interact in a highly complex ballet, often expressed in the norms of administrative procedure. Well, now the Trump administration has asked agencies to eliminate 10 regulations for every one they propose. Here with some analysis, Wake Forest University law professor Sid Shapiro. Professor Shapiro, good to have you with us.
Hey, thank you. Happy to be here.
And you have studied this arcane area of law, which, arcane as it might be, really affects literally every American. And what's your take on this idea? Because every administration comes in with the regulatory agenda that it had.
This fits into a rather long history, dating all the way back to President Carter and then President Reagan. And the idea of those reformers was to bring some economic insights and economic analysis into which regulations are a good idea and which ones are not such a good idea. So what the Reagan administration proposed, which was then further formalized by President Clinton, and then followed by every other president, so this has been entirely bipartisan, is that when agencies issue significant regulations costing $100 million or more, they'll do a cost-benefit analysis. They'll figure out the economic benefits and the economic costs. And as I said, this has been a staple of regulatory analysis in the government like forever. The way that the Trump proposal departs from that, as it did during his first administration, is they're only looking at costs. So they're basically saying, we want to bring down the costs of regulation. And to get there, we might have to eliminate any number of regulations. And we're going to do that regardless of what benefits they're bringing. So that's inconsistent with our history.
Right. So just to make an absurd example, if a regulation against asbestos or something was costly and it was removed, you would have the cost removed, but you would inherit the dangers of the chemical, in other words.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, these calculations are difficult to do, particularly on the benefit side. And there's a little bit of toing and froing. Each side kind of has its own numbers, as you would suspect. But the overall pattern is that government regulation almost always generates greater benefits than costs. And the courts look at that. That's one of the things they consider on judicial review to determine whether or not to uphold a regulation as not being arbitrary or capricious, is whether or not reasonable estimates show the benefits exceed the costs.
A couple of questions. One on the area of arbitrary and capricious. There have been some court cases where agencies have proposed what seems like something within their purview, but it really wasn't statutory. And they were stretching, if you want to put it that way, their sense of what they were statutorily entitled to regulate. And so how do you make sure that doesn't happen and yet some benefit occurs?
When agencies get sued, they have two obligations under the Administrative Procedure Act, which is the code that all federal agencies, departments have to follow. One is that, as we just said, regulations cannot be arbitrary and capricious. There has to be a rational or reasonable reason behind them. The other is they have to have statutory authority for what they're doing. And so the courts have been looking very closely at whether or not they're authorized to take a certain action or adopt a certain rule. And if they're not, it'll get struck down.
And it's fair to say, really, that administrations of both parties have been playing a little bit footloose on that front for some time now.
Right. In one of the major cases that many of your listeners may be familiar with, called Loper-Bright, the Supreme Court changed its methodology of statutory review. But they were reviewing a regulation passed by President Biden. And in that, EPA did try to stretch its regulatory authority. I don't think that can be disputed. And whether or not that was authorized was more contestable, but the court said no. And so that certainly was an example of the Biden administration attempting to push the envelope and didn't quite get away with it.
We're speaking with Sid Shapiro. He's a law professor at Wake Forest University, and by the way, co-author of a new book, How Government Built America. And then on the question I had besides arbitrariness, what's your sense of the capacity of the Office of Management and Budget and specifically OIRA, that little obscure agency unknown to the public, but that's where the regulations go to be evaluated to decide whether they allow the agency to go forward with it. The capacity of OIRA to make sound judgment that's reasonably free of politics, if that's possible, but also that it makes sense economically and in terms of societal benefit, given how complicated things have gotten.
Well, that office has always been sort of invisible. It's often been said they're the office that is so important to the regulatory state that no one knows about. And it's always been controversial, again, in all kinds of administrations, because there's a tension between economic analysis and what we can learn through it and what Congress has said to agencies about when they're supposed to take action, when they're supposed to regulate. And by and large, Congress has authorized agencies pretty clearly to regulate when it's necessary to protect the public. That's expressed in different ways. But none of those ways, except for a few statutes, say it has to pass a cost-benefit test. And that's in recognition that the benefits are pretty hard to measure. We don't always know those. And we may know that it looks like it's going to protect a large number of people. Actually figuring out the monetary benefits of that is pretty difficult. So we've always had this tension between the economic analysis as a kind of general test about appropriateness and the specific agency mandate, which is almost never stated in cost-benefit terms. So that automatically makes that office, which has tended to focus on economic analysis, controversial in its own right.
But they do have a history of making some difficult calculations. I think in the 90s, maybe it was, they determined a dollar value of a human life in relation to regulation, say, for automobiles. Well, if this safety regulation will save 10,000 lives, that's one thing. If it'll only save one life, but it costs the industry $100 million, then they don't do it. Sounds cold-hearted, but maybe that's the only way you can have any reasonable process.
Well, it all depends how you apply the cost-benefit analysis. If you actually think it's a formula and it'll tell you what to do, you're probably mistaken, but there's certainly times when that office seems to apply that approach. If you think of it as kind of a filter, a way of checking up on the agency and its more general mandate, then that might be appropriate. And people are divided on that, but it's now been along for so long, it's just built into the accepted way of thinking about regulation.
The unspoken element that seems to be needed is some kind of, civic comity, will you say, perhaps, or judgment, discretion, and restraint in proposing regulations and looking at them with some kind of a greater picture in mind. There's a human element in regulation that sometimes gets overlooked, but I think it's really real.
Well, that's right. Back to my idea, there's no formula for doing this, but the people doing it over time, based on evidence and context, and most importantly, experience, develop a set of ideas of what works and what doesn't work. And that's actually very key to having reasonable regulation, is you have to leave room for judgment. There's just no way to do this mathematically. And that's why it is important to have people who have that experience and have that judgment making these determinations.
Judgment and goodwill.
Right.
And before we let you go, I'd mentioned you did write a book recently out, How Government Built America, which has an odd sound to it. But I wanted to have you discuss that notion in the context of an event that's affecting the state of Maryland, and that was the knocking down of that bridge a little bit more than a year ago. That is an essential piece of infrastructure on the East Coast. It brought together regulation, whether they were applied properly, federal funding, who builds it. It benefits commerce and all that. And everything seems to come together in an incident like that. Maybe you could give a brief analysis.
Sure, I'd be happy to. What our book does is look at how the mix of government and the market system has developed over time in America. And what we found was that going all the way back to the colonies, government has been an important element in that mix. And it's engaged in certain essential functions since the beginning. And one of those was infrastructure. Alexander Hamilton was the advocate of building roads and canals. And this recognizes that private markets are always going to underinvest in bridges, in roads, in